Okay. Did you already get all the B-roll? Yeah. All right. Uh, who do you want to talk first?
I'm going to clear my throat.
Okay.
Excuse me. Sorry, y'all.
Not at all. We're going to get B-roll, so I just want you to be looking at me and kind of nodding as we're
Yes.
talking, and we'll get that in case we need an edit point,
Understood.
and then you'll just have that. And Donna, can you mute you just so that there we go. Anyhow, so just and then you'll just sit and nod, and it's so neat. One of the neat things about the experience of you, of getting a chance to learn about you, is to I love hearing my story in a completely different metaphor, from a
Yes.
different. That's one of the things about, I never get bored in a 12-step meeting.
Never, ever.
Because I just sit there, I'll sit there and I'll just go, oh my God. Okay, my story. How about you?
Oh, are you asking how I feel about that?
Yeah.
Oh, it's amazing the resonance that we can find in with people who have seemingly very, very different backgrounds, and we have at the core that thing. And not, I mean, some people might say yes, it's the disease, but I feel like that's a good shorthand word for it. But there's so much more. There's some essence. We're aliens, you know. Yeah. And I don't mean that in a terminally unique way. I mean it, we are different. And only in going into the rooms could I really feel genuinely at home. And it doesn't mean that it's always easy in there, obviously. Sometimes there are clashes, maybe in my head, maybe, you know, out loud. But still at the core, there's something, there's resonance. Yeah.
How's that? Okay, great. All right, and what I'd like to start with is spike knitting. Okay, and just get a shot of us together, and we're just going to be quiet for a little while and just start the knitting, and then see where the conversation goes. Such an ancient art.
It is.
How far back do you think it goes?
I actually should know the answer to that off the top of my head, and I want to say 3000 BC, maybe. In Egypt, they found socks, or the remnants of socks. Maybe if you get me started talking about textiles, we'll probably be here for, I think you said 200 hours.
The first 200 hours.
The first 200 hours, yeah. So I'm an accidental, I don't really love the word expert, kind of has some ego in it, but I know quite a bit about textiles, accidentally. It's my passion.
How did that happen?
Well, let's see, when I was little, we did a lot of arts and crafts. I have 8 siblings. I have this vague memory of once telling my mother, like, thank you for all the arts and crafts. And I feel like her answer, I'm totally paraphrasing here, but it was something like, I didn't, you know, less like, I didn't do it so much to inspire creativity, but more so that you all would leave me alone for an hour. So, you know, I wouldn't kill you or whatever. And I took to crafting at a very, very young age. I started knitting in 1986 and I quit after my first scarf. I'd had a trauma. My sister was teaching me to knit, one of my sisters, to help me calm down. But I poured all of my trauma into this kind of knotty scarf, and I set down knitting for 14 years, I think, and then I picked it up again. But somewhere in the midst of all that, I was writing features for the Dallas Morning News. I was a freelancer, and I had to generate as many ideas as I could, because if you don't generate ideas as a freelancer, you're not going to get paid.
That's right. You got to go in, pitch the managing editor, or pitch whomever.
Pitch. Yeah, I did features, and so I would ask friends for ideas, and one of my friends, who's an avid quilter, she said, "Why don't you do a piece about quilts?" And so I wrote a piece about quilts, and somehow that morphed into a book about quilts, and then that morphed into the beginnings of a documentary, which I never finished. I have some of the footage somewhere, and then that morphed into a second book about quilts, and then that morphed into a gigantic book about quilts. It's kind of like a comprehensive history of quilts throughout, like the entire history of quilts.
Wow.
It was a difficult project. It didn't pay well. The book is massive. And sometimes if you look for it on Amazon, it's out of print. Sometimes the price point for used copies will be higher than I can afford, because there weren't that many of them. And it's full of all these pictures. And then, then that all happened like I want to say that happened in the mid-2000s.
You were born what year? Let's ground all these things.
1964.
So you were born in 64. Mm-hmm. We're now in 2019. Mm-hmm. We're in August of 2019. Mm-hmm. I always like to ground things in where we were historically, because I don't think you can take people out of history.
No, and I was born, I mean, I guess everyone can make an argument that something significant happened around their birth. I was born a few weeks, let me think. I was born about 6 weeks after Kennedy was shot.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So it was a pretty tumultuous, I mean, it's always a tumultuous time, but it was a pretty tumultuous time. And I was also born right after the publication of Feminine Mystique, which I do think really had a huge impact.
That would be Germaine Greer?
No, that was Betty Friedan.
Betty Friedan, of course it was. Thank you.
Yeah, and there's, I read a great book about the history of the Feminine Mystique, which is called A Strange Stirring, and it's by, oh, I want to kick myself for not remembering. But it shows the impact that book had on women, and primarily middle class, upper middle class white women. But I feel like the effects of that book definitely trickled down and touched my life. So I have 3 older sisters, and they went more traditional route in life, teacher, secretary. Who knows if the Feminine Mystique actually is contributed to how I've turned out how I'm turning out.
Right.
But I feel like, and also I was 4 or 5, the summer of love. Like, there was so much protest. My 6th grade teacher, who taught me how to play the guitar, she had been really active in this Vietnam War protests and stuff.
Sure.
So I was shaped by activists who didn't necessarily use the word activist or feminist, but who role modeled for me. Yeah.
You had a chance to say, wait a minute. I mean, like, who were you in high school?
The overachiever of the universe. And I mean that in both directions. I'll tell you what I mean by that. So I was president of the student body, president of the student council.
In New Jersey? In
South Jersey, yeah. And I was slated to graduate a year early because I had was academically very gifted.
Yes.
Gifted. We could even have a side conversation about the word gifted.
Yeah.
I did very well academically.
Exactly.
And I advanced through classes very quickly. Starting out, like, from 1st grade on, they kind of didn't know what to do with me. I'd wind up being pushed into a lot of independent study. So when it came time, I was scheduled to graduate in 1982. I was going to jump a year, and then due to some bureaucratic changing of rules, I had to stick around. So I didn't really have any classes to take. And so what I did was I was president of the student council. I was in all these clubs. I was really kind of overactive, overachiever on the one hand. On the other hand, I was already, I think it's fair to say at that point, I was deeply entrenched in alcoholism at that point. Although we didn't call it that. We called it like being a teenager in New Jersey. I didn't know the word alcoholic. So I was on, it was just strange, right? So I could...
How did the alcohol mitigate your learning ability, because
It
I mean
didn't.
it affects different people differently. People don't.
It didn't. It didn't. I mean, I could still I still excelled. With very little effort. You know, I graduated really close to the top of my class, and I was not alone in this. So I went to this high school where it was a junior, senior high school, and when you entered in seventh grade, so seventh through 12th, without any kind of they didn't make any secrets about it. They organized us into 10 groups, and they called us Section A through Section J. And if you were in Section A, you were like the smart kids, you
Sure.
know. And you know, imagine putting somebody saying, "Well, I'm in Section J." It was a terrible system.
Wow.
But in Section A, probably in the other sections too, there were many of us who were overachieving and who also drank like crazy. I mean, it was
Sure.
the culture. We didn't have a lot of the awareness that we do now around like, oh, this addiction thing and kids. And I don't think it affected me at all. I worked maybe 30 or 40 hours a week. I did my academics. I would run events at the school. I had a lot of energy. I think maybe the alcohol was, I know it was like a buffer and an escape for me from being in an having an abusive parent. Yeah, it was, and maybe there's so many things I know now that I didn't know then, right? So I have post-traumatic stress disorder, and I
Sure.
feel like underneath of that umbrella is the depression and the anxiety. So I feel like the alcohol was partly social lubricant. I'm also an introvert. I know I'm all the things, but whatever. It was a social lubricant. It was also self-medication, you know? Yeah.
And you went out of there. Were you Spike then? Did you carry that?
I will tell you this, and I don't often talk about my birth certificate name. Mostly the reason I don't talk about my birth certificate name, well, there's lots of reasons, but one is
Sure.
that I perform weddings as I wear many hats, but
You do?
about half a dozen times a year, some guy, I'll call it the holy roller uncle, will corner me at a wedding and demand to know my religious credentials, and your name isn't really Spike. And I'm just like, whatever. But I will tell you this because it's a fun little anecdote. People will often say, like, what's your given name?
Yeah.
And I'll say, well, Spike was given to me. You know, it was given to me when I was 19.
lovely.
A friend of mine gave me that
I
line.
love it.
But I tell people, well, I'll let you take a guess. I'll say, I was born a few weeks after Kennedy was shot, and that's a clue. And once somebody said, is your name Oswald? But it's not. It's Jacqueline. And
Yeah.
when I was in college, I was a punk rocker. I mean, I still am a punk rocker, but I had this punk rock haircut, and these frat boys were making fun of me and really rude. So I wrote this letter to the editor of the school paper, and at that point, I had recently been given the nickname Spike by a dorm mate.
Sure.
And so I signed the article, Jacqueline Spike Gillespie, and that was it, like off and running.
Oh,
Yeah,
God,
off
how
and running.
exciting.
So that's been with me since I was maybe 19 years old.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
wonderful. What year were you 19?
I guess I went to university, let's see, that must have been 83. Yeah, so if
Okay.
I do the math, I think 83.
All right, so you're 80,
Yeah, 83, 83,
All
yeah.
right, so the early 80s in Jersey and
Florida. I
Florida.
ran away to school in Florida.
Got it. And then, so you discover your creative spark to writing. Was that carried all the way through? Did you do the poetry as a what?
Thanks for all these questions. I feel so self-indulgent. I love telling the stories. I started writing very early. As soon as I could hold a pencil and knew the alphabet and learn how to shape words, I would write a lot. And I have another theory about my writing, which is this: in the house I grew up in,
Yeah.
we weren't allowed to speak. I mean that literally. We weren't allowed to speak when my father was in the house. And we were not allowed to have feelings or express feelings. I mean, obviously we had feelings, but you couldn't express those. And so I think now looking back that my first addiction probably was books. I was a constant reader. It's wonderful. It's such a beautiful escape. And I still read all the time. And I don't feel, I'm not going to go to a recovery group for reading. Reading is my comfort. It's the thing I
Yes.
do. But writing also. So I started to write my first book when I was 10. I remember this. It was about a talking saxophone named Max. I didn't finish it. But from the early on, and I would win essay contests in like fifth grade, I'd write like, firefighters are good or pollution is bad. And it's entirely possible I won because I may have been one of like the only entrants or something. And I'm not being self-deprecating. I'm saying contextually, I don't know the circumstances, but whatever the case, that was external validation, and it inspired me to keep going. So I wrote for the high school newspaper, and I wrote for a lot of the content in my senior yearbook. And then in college, when I wrote this angry letter to the editor, they said, we want to run this as a guest column, and we'd like to give you a job. And so that angry letter, my anger, anger can be anger is an energy. Johnny Rotten said that, yeah. So that's how it's been with me forever. Yeah.
And so much of your writing is about your experience of life and your experience and your healing and your wholeness. So there is a therapeutic component?
There is. And, I think some people, I'll let the defensive part of myself answer first. And,
please, would you call the committee
the committee's
in session and allow the first, we shall recognize the defensive-ness.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Well, there are definitely, everyone's going to have their critics, right? And I unfortunately, I do have the internal committee, but I know that my writing is not for everyone. And in one particular interview, maybe we'll talk about this later, but that was in the Texas Observer.
Sure.
It was just the writer eviscerated me. It was a complete character assassination, and he was so angry.
Yeah.
And years later, I met one of his ex-girlfriends at a party, and she told me that he had really serious mother issues, and that she really felt like this had informed his. I mean, it was so horrible. This was before the Texas Observer was online, and all my friends who saw it, they refused to give me copies, and I couldn't find a copy in the store. It was really, you can still find it online.
Yeah.
But so my writing is not for everybody, but I'll say this: I think first and foremost, it brings healing to my life. But I will say, I get a fair amount of reader mail that indicates to me, people will say things like, wow, I could never have said that myself in writing or out loud. I might lose my job or my kid or my marriage or my sanity.
Yeah.
I appreciate you saying that. And the way that I feel, the way I've tried to describe it sometimes is, sometimes I feel almost like I was born without a filter. People will say, you're so courageous, you're so brave. And I feel like, again, when I use the word gift, I use it carefully. I had someone get very angry at me once for that because he felt like I was saying that I am gifted and other people aren't. What I was trying to express to him was, sometimes I feel like I'm channeling. I know that can sound corny, but I feel like this last book that I just wrote, and we can talk about that in a little bit, it feels like pure channeling. So it's not like I don't really feel brave and courageous necessarily. I feel like these things happen to me. I need to exercise them from me and hope. And if they serve other people, well, that's great.
God. The evolution. One of the things that I want to talk about is how do we avoid, because the instant that I get into the comparative mode, I lose. I lose my peace of mind. I lose my spontaneity. Because the instant I'm in that comparative mode. So staying out of the comparative and saying that, okay, well, I have one job, and that's to be, I am identically unique. And I have one job, and that is to be the absolute best manifestation of Dennis Tardan that I can possibly be. I cannot compare myself to Spike. I cannot compare myself to, I have to have that unique, and so I use that as my
I love that. I'm going to carry that with me. Thank you. That's really powerful. That's really powerful.
Can you talk about your evolution because before we get into because I want to get into the book and I want to get into the new projects and I want to get you doing, but I want to get some foundational stuff. How has this evolved in your own understanding of a power greater than you are? Because both of us have experienced time. We've been with friends in recovery and who choose to be anonymous and for years and years. And this evolution of a higher power, whatever that means, and how can you talk about that evolution in your life?
I can, and I think I'm understanding the question clearly. I'll riff on it. We'll see well,
Yeah.
there is no wrong
Yeah.
answer. I was raised with Catholicism, and in my memory, in my version of the story, and I practice.
I love versions.
Well, I qualify it now because I do have 8 siblings, and if we were ever a study group, we all have. I mean, it's really fascinating, you know.
Isn't it
But
though?
yes, and so I was raised with Catholicism, and I like to say that my father had his own special brand. It's like there was, as if it weren't enough fire and brimstone. I would be told with regularity that I was going to hell and that God was punishing me. Now, despite this, I took to Catholicism like I was very serious about it from a very early age. I was the youngest lector at our church. I was maybe, I don't know, maybe 12 or 13. I would get up and read the Gospels. It's funny to even have that memory. I would go to Good Friday services on my own, which is not a holy day of obligation, but it's the 3 hours
Sure.
where Christ is dying on the cross. I have a really vivid memory once of I don't remember who came in first, me or my father, but this weird. I think part of my dedication was maybe he was so connected to his religion that I wanted to connect with him.
Sure.
And I wanted this bolt of lightning experience. Well, not only did I not get that, but to really fast forward the story, maybe the first time my father disowned me was probably around the time I ditched the Catholic Church. And that's a really painful and fed a lot of the anger that I had that maybe I didn't even know that I had. It's my identity's lost now, right? So I don't know what to do with myself.
Sure.
And then I would say, I guess maybe atheist, agnostic. I feel like they're one and the same.
Yeah.
And in college, and then somewhere along the way, I started reading Buddhist philosophy, and even still, like, I call myself a quasi-Buddhist. I really don't want to get attached, and that's a good Buddhist way to be, to any like organized religion. So I've been on meditation retreats and stuff, but I really feel like I like the philosophy of it. And then when I finally, when I say finally, I quit. Well, I know in anonymous programs we don't specifically identify which ones we're in, but I will say that I stopped
Sure.
drinking in 2000 with a few single days out.
Yeah.
I didn't step into the rooms until the end of 2017. One big thing that kept me out, or that I told myself kept me out, was I knew the word God was going to be bandied about a lot. I had tiptoed into the rooms once or twice.
Yeah.
And to this day, when I'm chairing a meeting, or even if I'm only sharing, if it's a God-heavy meeting, much to the irritation of the more traditionally religious people in the room, I will always say, if you don't believe in God, and if you're a newcomer, and this is scaring you,
Yeah.
can we cuss in here?
Yep.
If this is scaring the shit out of you or making you want to run away and never come back, if you want to talk to somebody about how can an atheist, or I call myself non-theistic, I think that's
Right.
a better way to put it, how can I be in this room and hear this language? And some people might get upset and be like, well, it's just shorthand for this or that. For me, the word God and religion itself was used as a tool of abuse. I take language
Words
seriously.
matter.
They do. I take language really seriously. So getting around to higher power, I had this roommate, Bob, and I know we'll talk about Bob in a little bit. But when I thought, I have no trouble understanding there's something greater beyond me. Connection, whatever, butterflies, my dogs, the way I talk to, like having an instant connection sometimes with a cashier or something.
Yep.
I get it. But to like designate something or some notion to a specific higher power for me to talk to, I can't remember when I decided it was Bob, my former roommate, but I that worked so well for me because Bob loved me unconditionally. He was so gentle, and even when he saw me making really poor choices where I was really hurting myself, like in ways that would have been obvious to like a drunken 2-year-old, but I couldn't see for myself, he would never be harsh with me. He would only love me like a feral animal that he was coaxing back to health. And so I talk to Bob all the time. That's an easy one.
So he's a spike whisperer.
He is, and ironically, he's he's a white dude, an older white dude, which is like the kind of image of God that I wanted to.
Isn't it? Oh.
And a Republican, I might add, but that's okay because.
But you have to have that. See, that's what I love about the story. Has to have that. Are you kidding? I mean, it has to have that in order to be the story.
Well, and the inoculation often comes from it comes from whatever the causes the disease. I think about that. Yeah, the vaccine.
Yeah. Yeah. And there you have it. So here. In this sense, in the understanding of a power greater than we are, if like I'm a fish, and I'm in the ocean, and I'm not even thinking about that I'm in the water, and that's like if there is nothing separate from, then there isn't an outside to be looking at it at us from the outside. That it's this wonderful immersion sense, and so there is no not. I grew up Christian Science, that scientists and all that, and one of the phrases that they had in there is that there is not a spot where God is not.
I love it.
So that just encompasses it all. All right. So now what we make out of this. That's a different thing. Now, I might have an opinion, but it's certainly not going to change this entire element. There is no judgment in that sense outside of what we all are.
Right. And I like this whole no judgment thing. I mean, I'm a very judgy person. I'll be honest with you.
Are you kidding?
I love your blue shirt. I mean, there you go. And judgment.
Judgment. There is no. I don't think that there is. Judgment is such an important aspect of it. And when I think about judgment, okay, is that if I can have discernment.
I was going to say discernment. I love that you picked that word. Yes, discernment.
And because when I have judgment, there is something about it that I'm having to make someone else wrong. Right. As opposed to, and I'm really getting a chance to, right now as we're looking at this, here in August of 2019, we're coming up upon an election season, and we're getting an opportunity, and we're looking at these, that human beings, is that it appears as if that the media, not just the media, but certain aspects of our society are attempting to divide us, to say that we're separate.
Yes.
That we're separate, that we have, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to meet you and get to know you, is because you have the exact opposite philosophy, that we are together. We are together, whether we like it or not. And I say that, but I want to point out that, despite that being my philosophy or my belief, I could give you easily off the top of my head 50 examples of how I don't necessarily practice what I purport to believe in, like because it's hard to be a human on the planet, you know. So I want to own that part. Thank you. Yeah, I don't have it all figured out. I don't have any of it figured out. None of it. Spike, and I love that because it is hard. Life is hard, one day at a time. I love some of the stories from the big book, because you sit there and the person will get sober, and then then you think, okay, well, that's the end of the story, but no, then their kid dies, and then they go through a divorce, and then they get a bankruptcy, and then they have to go to jail, and they have to go to that, and then they come back and they go, well, I'm still sober, and I'm learning, and I'm growing, and it's just not. Life is complicated. Life is, and I love those parts of the stories too, because when I first got into the rooms, another thing that kept me out, well, I kept myself out. That would be the way I would say it now that I've been in for not quite 2 years. But I didn't like the word powerless, because I didn't feel powerless. I put down the drink.
and stayed away from it for the better part of 17 years. Like, I like to always own those couple of day
Sure.
exceptions. That feels important. But when I finally got a sponsor, which took me a while, I was afraid of everything when I went in there, and I had emotionally bottomed out. That's what sent me in, and I was a wreck. I was fending off suicidal ideation on a regular basis. I write about it at length in the Tao of Bob. But anyway, when I did get a sponsor, and I was very fortunate, I chose an incredible sponsor, and she's still my sponsor. And she said, when I said the word powerless is like, it's too hard for me to deal with. I don't feel powerless. And she said, well, why don't you look at the other word in there, which is unmanageable? Well, I could really connect with unmanageable quickly. And since
Yes.
she was really gentle, I know some people have hard-ass sponsors, and she is very gentle and compassionate. And in helping me start that way, like instead of saying, this is why you have to understand the word powerless, she said, well, let's look at the other part of the sentence. And in that gentleness and compassion, slowly it opened up my eyes and my ears and my heart, that now I still don't always love the word powerless, but I can connect with it more than I could initially. Yeah.
I love the unmanageability, because the idea of unmanageable, it keeps me in the idea of manageable is results orientation. If I could just make this situation come out, this person, this come out in a certain way, then it's going to feed me or get me in something. But I'm powerless. People are unmanageable.
They
Events,
sure are.
footwork. Now that I can do.
Right.
Footwork is my job.
Yeah.
Results.
Can't get attached. I mean, you can get attached. I get attached to results and outcome all the time, and that's a really big thing I'm working on right now. It's funny. I'm attached to the outcome of letting go of the attached outcomes. There's some
Absolutely, which is that mirror
puzzling.
effect, right?
It is the mirror effect. Yeah, yeah.
And that's where. So let's talk about the. You're a writer. You're being published in not just the Dallas Morning News, but you're being published around. And so what is life like or you're thinking about that as part of your career path, your life path, the story of Spike?
Well, actually, so in 2010, I always remember this. I remember things, like my timelines usually connect to an unfortunate relationship I was in, or an international location.
A series
where
of
I was.
unfortunate relationships.
Yeah,
there's a great title.
Or it'll connect to like where I have a really incredible memory, which we don't have time to discuss, but I can remember like names and dates. I can tell you the middle name of the best friend of a guy I dated for like 3 months in 1995. I'm not going to do that, but I'm thinking of it right now. So I can't always remember everything, but the things I remember in great detail.
Sure.
So I was sitting at Benny's Cafe in Rehoboth, Israel, when I get this message from my last writing contract. It was sort of an advertorial. I was writing a blog for JetBlue about how great Austin was, and the money dried up. And at that point, I'd already been. It was always a struggle with journalism before the internet, but at that point I was just like, I can't keep doing this. I can't keep begging for money and freaking out and being in a panic all the time. And I'd already begun performing weddings, so I immediately contacted my webmaster and I said, take my kooky, eccentric, catch-all website and let's turn it into a wedding website.
And that is where we will pick up part 2.
Okay, that was
exactly at that place.
Okay, that was really fast.
Oh, shit.
Great conversation.
This is such
Thank
fun.
you.
We are just like I said, the first of 200 hours that we could continue to talk, because this is one of the things that I love about this is